Welcome to the Unwashed Asses, episode 125, recorded for Monday, September 9th, 2019. PlayStation is it's kept me enthralled, it's kept me engaged. I know I mentioned last week that I'd started playing God of War, and much like Spider-Man before it, I've been utterly captivated and enthralled and sucked into a world that, while I'd always heard was good, I'm late to the party, but now greatly enjoying myself. Hi, my name's Christian, and I talk more about video games than anything else. With the PlayStation, the idea was always that I'm going to be playing primarily single-player offline games, and it's pretty much held true. It's become my favorite of the console generations and platforms, in the sense that I feel I'm really getting the most for my money out of it. The Xbox was focused primarily on multiplayer, playing with groups of friends, and the same thing is essentially holding true for PC, which is really just a Destiny machine at this point. The persistent online worlds and always feeling like I have to grind and try and keep up with the pack, it gets tiring, and the PlayStation has been such an amazing respite in that I can take my time, I can binge on games if I want to, but it's me versus the simulation, and I don't have to worry about leaderboards or anything else. It's just focusing on my one character and their journey, and really enjoying some of the what I consider the pinnacle of storytelling in terms of gaming. But Spider-Man and now God of War have really just kept me enthralled and engaged in a way that other titles haven't. Like, for instance, Bloodborne and Horizon Zero Dawn, while both extremely good, I kind of fall in and out of them, where I'll play them for a bit and then put them down and then come back and try to figure out what I was doing, and I still have yet to beat either one. I'm a good way into each of them, just haven't quite beaten them, and maybe I'm going to keep that streak continued here once I've got God of War wrapped up. But I guess let's get into some first impressions. This isn't going to be a full-on review. There will probably be some spoilers, but I definitely wanted to get it out of the system because I don't really have anybody else to talk to about it, and since the game has already been out for a year, I don't feel necessarily comfortable going into like the subreddit or forums to espouse my love for this game. But I now understand why everybody fell in love with it and was doing all the memes and talking incessantly about it, because it is utterly phenomenal. It's had as much of an impact, I think, as the initial Portal series did, but unlike Portal, I wasn't hating all the memes that came of it. So, in this iteration, Kratos has essentially isolated himself. He has exiled himself, is more apt to say, from Greece and Sparta and everything that had taken place. Now, I say all of this with the preface that the only God of War game that I really played and even beat was Chains of Olympus on PSP. Didn't really play 1, 2, or 3, but I have a pretty good idea what happened based on, the wikis and story synopsis. And that any of that really matters thus far in here. The game opens up with Kratos and his boy Atreus as they are chopping down a tree and preparing a pyre for their wife and mother who's just recently passed, and they've embarked on a journey to take her ashes to the highest peak in all the realms and scatter them. And what would you think would be a typically quiet and relatively easy endeavor, aside from some mountain climbing, turns into an epic story as Kratos and Atreus are drawn farther into this world that at this point I'm feeling was a bit planned out and a bit preordained by Kratos' wife and Atreus' mother, because shortly after burning her body and And going on a quick hunt, they return to the home and are attacked by a strange tattooed man who cannot feel anything and stands toe-to-toe with Kratos himself. And those familiar with Kratos knows he is the literal embodiment. He is the god of war after taking the title from Ares and ruled justly, thusly, before taking out pretty much the entire Greek pantheon. So anybody that can stand toe-to-toe with him is probably a mythological figure, and probably a god, if not a titan, or whatever the equivalent is in the other mythologies. So we, not shortly thereafter, several hours into the game, find out that this character was Balder. And if you're like me, you know next to nothing about Norse mythology aside from what Marvel's told you. And turns out Thor's not at all like the Chris Hemsworth portrayal, nor is Loki, and Odin is more akin to Neil Gaiman's interpretation in American Gods than the warm-hearted, caring figure portrayed by Sir Anthony Hopkins. No, they're all assholes, as most portrayals of ancient Greek gods would be. It's like I'm seeing a lot of similarities here, and that's something that I will say is that while I knew basics of Norse mythology, I had very little to no interest in delving into them. I was never really big into Vikings and all that until Hellblade really got my engine revved for that. But it was more Celtic than anything else. And so with a crash course essentially in an interpreted version of Norse mythology, I'm now enthralled. I've spent many a night sitting up reading what I will say are lackluster Wikipedia articles that give you a base overview of the characters, but they don't really delve into their stories and their mythos. So I'm looking for a good book, essentially, kind of like if you remember in high school, or if your high school even did this, where you had to read, you had the book of Greek mythology and you read all the stories and fables and parables. I'm looking for something similar for Norse mythology, and I've heard that Neil Gaiman actually put out a really good one with his kind of spin on it, but stays truthful, so we'll see. Either way, I'm engaged in this world that I would not have expected, and for that, God of War has been utterly phenomenal in its storytelling, where kind of like, you know, Spider-Man, you have the main story, which is clearly marked out. Like, you have a map, you have objective markers. So if you want to do all the extra stuff, you're able to, and avoid the main story. But unlike Spider-Man, God of War is tuned to a very difficult degree in its challenges. At the beginning of the game, I thought I was just terrible at it. I didn't know how to play it, that the controls were wonky. And while little bits of that were true, in large part, just you're playing on a crippled version of Kratos. And this is a man who's been exiled for we don't know how long, decades, if not, a few hundred years. And so, yeah, he's a bit rusty. He's not playing with his full deck. And the enemies he's fighting have come to play. While things like Draugr aren't necessarily the most difficult, when you're just starting off the game, sure as shit, they're really hard. But as the game opens up and you start crafting new gear and getting better upgrades and putting in runes that give you different abilities, this is where the game truly starts to open up, and you start having variety in how you play the game and tackle the different challenges. Now, challenges themselves, while a large part of them are focused on combat, and you have a wonderful sidekick in the boy himself, Atreus, who plays support in an archer role, stunning or electrifying enemies or calling out animal companions. The bulk of it, the heavy lifting, is going to come down to Kratos and his abilities themselves. And I still feel like while there are different combat styles between, just bare fists or using the Leviathan axe or the chains of Sparta that I've yet to unlock, there's a lot of variety and freedom in how you play it, but at the same time it's focused because certain enemies are weak to certain things and completely immune to others, like the Ice Draugr. you can't use the Leviathan axe. They just kind of scoff it off, and you have to go barehanded. At least I do, because I don't have anything else. And it's frustrating in the sense that if you're trying to engage in all the extra challenges you can before, essentially you're wandering around and leveling up outside before going inside for the main boss fight, it's hard to do in God of War, just because there are some challenges that are designed for this is clearly your end game content, and I'm at this weird middle ground where I think I've progressed quite a bit of ways into the story, but there's got to be a lot more, because some of these challenges I'm running into are downright impossible. And though it plays a bit like a Souls game, in the sense that pay attention to how your enemy moves, what their attacks are, and so on and so forth, some of these challenges can't be overcome until you essentially have upgraded your gear or gotten different sets of weapons. And that is a bit disheartening. While I have been able to kind of cheese my way out of a couple victories just by relying on Atreus, it doesn't present the challenge that I would have hoped for in a God of War game, where if I want to go out and essentially play it on hard mode, where enemies have insane amount of life, they don't take much damage from me, allow me to do so. But don't artificially have a difficulty in place where I can do next to no damage to a particular enemy just because I don't have the correct weapon for it. Or my health pool, like they'll literally one-shot my character just because I don't have enough armor or the right kind of armor. And then that's the thing, is it's hard to know what kind of difficulty spike you're going to run into, because it is an open world. And you're getting into things that you shouldn't necessarily get into, and you only realize this and essentially after you've already died, and you have to restart at the checkpoint and then walk back out of whatever dungeon you were in, because you're not going to be able to take the boss at this point. And then it becomes a matter of trying to remember what you were doing and where you were doing it after the fact. And some of the puzzles in the game are very much examples of this. Well, you'll run into something that you can't beat or progress through because you don't have the right ability or item. And when you do get that right ability or item, you know, I'm a couple dozen hours into the game, it's hard to remember, like, oh, where was this thing that I needed to go do? And adding into that confusion is that the game itself, the landscape changes as you progress through the story. And so even if you might have a general idea of where something was, the landscape is now drastically changed, and you have to not only remember the vague idea where something was, but how do you get to it now? Because you have all this extra terrain that's been added, this extra layer of dungeon. And so I'm torn in how I want to tackle the game, as far as, do I just focus on the main story and eventually hit a point where, you know, like games of old, like, okay, I'm at the final boss fight, before I do that, let me do all this extra side content? Or do I keep trying to do all the side content that I can, and failing every now and then going back to the main storyline? I don't know. I like to do things in clearly divided chunks, and God of War isn't giving me that opportunity. And there are some like side missions where I've already received them, but I have no idea if I can even get to where they want, just because the story has me locked out of certain parts of the map. It's kind of sloppy in how all the content is handled. It's not a streamlined experience, and that is one fault I will give it. But the overall world that they're building is utterly fantastic. It is a breathtaking game, and in terms of scope and beauty, like the witch's hut is in this beautiful flowered meadow underneath a giant turtle, and there's these beautiful red maples everywhere as birch trees are dotting the landscape, and you have these ancient Nordic runes surrounding the landscape everywhere, and the world serpent, Jormungandr, rising out of the Lake of Nine and greeting you with his big bellowing voice really reminded me of like when you meet Rasputin on Mars, and you have this overwhelming sense of awe as you encounter all of this. And I can't imagine games getting much better looking than what we have now, and just the artistry on display is utterly phenomenal. I've had many moments where it's like I'm just sitting back and drinking in what's happening and loving absolutely every second. And on that note, you also have this phenomenal relationship between Kratos and his son, where Kratos is a very emotionally stunted man, and him trying to raise a son is at times frustrating, where I'm trying to scream, at him like, hug your damn son. just hug him. He needs emotional support right now, you fucking monster. And at other times, the game will come out of left field and hit you with a sledgehammer of emotion, and you're left choking back tears like, you motherfucker, I wasn't anticipating that. And this is a story of just the two of them and their bonding and their journey together. And I'm left kind of reeling and not really sure where to expect. And they've quickly become some of my favorite characters in gaming, whereas Kratos, I didn't really give a shit about him in his own trilogy because he's your stereotypical guy with a bad goatee beating up droves of guys and living out that male power fantasy. Whereas this, he's a man trying to process the death of his wife while also raising a child, and doesn't know how to properly handle emotions and guide his son through grief, while at the same time embarking on this incredibly difficult and dangerous journey with him and getting wrapped up in a conflict he wanted no part of. It's utterly phenomenal, and I can see why people fell in love with it. And I've been, if you look at my Twitch summary, it's been 3 or 4 hour play sessions as I am just essentially gorging myself on this game. And the side characters you meet are so full of personality, and while they're sparse in terms of who they are, the impact you have as every character is fully fleshed out and realized, and there's a lot of depth to them. It's a great deal of quality over quantity, and I'm dying to get back home and play more of this game. Every time I'm out, it's all I can think about. And like I said, even after the game's over, I've now been introduced to this entire pantheon of characters and stories that, again, while I had a basic idea of, I had no idea the depths of how far they ran or what their ties were. Like, yeah, Greek mythology I have a very good grasp on, but Norse, not so much. And so I now have this entire other world to play in and this universe to explore, and I'm excited about that. So much like Spider-Man, though, once I've beat it and kind of consumed everything I can, I don't think there's DLC for this game. We'll do a full-on review, but again, I don't have many people to talk to about it, so I had to chew your ear for a bit. So thank you for indulging me. But that's going to wrap this one up. If you have your own thoughts, concerns, criticisms, critiques, complaints, or otherwise just want to shoot the shit about how amazing God of War is, drop an email to theunwashedasses@gmail.com. Again, theunwashedasses@gmail.com. And yeah, we'll have something up hopefully a little later this week. But thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Blood for the Blood God.